When my family said I was too old to be trusted with a vehicle, I could have argued with them or proven them wrong. I chose to prove them wrong by becoming the most successful senior Uber driver in 3 counties, and showing them that age brings skill, not disability. The intervention happened on a Tuesday afternoon, orchestrated with the kind of precision my children usually reserved for planning surprise birthday parties. I should have been suspicious when all 3 of them showed up at my house with serious expressions and matching manila folders, but I assumed they were there to discuss my upcoming 73rd birthday celebration. "Mom, we need to have a conversation about your driving," my eldest son Robert announced, settling into my living room chair with the authority of someone about to deliver unwelcome news. I had been behind the wheel for 55 years without a single major accident, had passed my last vision test with flying colors, and had reflexes that were still quick enough to catch falling dishes before they hit the floor. But apparently these credentials were insufficient to convince my children that I remained competent to operate a motor vehicle. "What specifically concerns you about my driving, Robert?" My daughter Patricia opened her manila folder with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Mom, last week you got confused about which exit to take on the highway. I took the next exit and turned around. That's called navigating, not being confused. And you've been driving slower lately," added my youngest son Michael. "Cars have been passing you more frequently." Driving slower. As if choosing to drive 5 miles under the speed limit for safety was evidence of incompetence rather than wisdom accumulated through decades of experience. But what they said next was what really revealed their assumptions about aging and ability. "Mom, we've done some research," Patricia continued, "and statistics show that drivers over 70 have significantly higher accident rates than younger drivers. We're worried that you're becoming a danger to yourself and other people." Statistics. They had reduced my individual competence to demographic generalizations, assuming that my chronological age automatically predicted my driving ability regardless of my actual performance behind the wheel. "Have I had any accidents recently?" "Well, no, but..." "Have I received any traffic citations?" "No, but that's not the point, Mom." "Then what exactly is the point?" Robert leaned forward with the expression of someone trying to be patient with a difficult child. "The point is that reaction times slow with age. Vision deteriorates, and judgment becomes impaired. These are natural consequences of aging that affect everyone, regardless of how competent they think they are." How competent they think they are. As if my assessment of my own abilities was delusional rather than based on actual evidence of my continued competence. "So what are you proposing?" Michael pulled out his own folder, apparently containing the solution they had collaboratively developed. "We think it would be best if you stopped driving voluntarily, before something happens. We've researched senior transportation services, ride-sharing options, and public transit routes that would meet all your mobility needs." Stopped driving voluntarily, the implication being that if I didn't surrender my independence willingly, they were prepared to take more forceful measures. "And what if I don't agree with your assessment?" Patricia's response revealed the full scope of their plan. "Mom, we've spoken to Dr. Henderson about our concerns. He's willing to recommend a driving evaluation that would provide an objective assessment of your abilities." An objective assessment. From a doctor who had never observed my driving, based on concerns raised by children who rode with me, perhaps twice a year, using evaluation criteria designed to identify the most severely impaired elderly drivers rather than assess normal age-related changes. But what they proposed next was what finally triggered my decision to prove them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. "We think you should consider selling your car," Robert said. "The money could be used for transportation services, and you wouldn't have to worry about insurance, maintenance, or the stress of driving in increasingly heavy traffic." Selling my car. The vehicle that represented my independence, my ability to go where I wanted when I wanted, my connection to a world beyond the boundaries my children were trying to establish for my safety. And what if I refuse? The silence that followed was telling. They had clearly discussed this possibility and had prepared responses that would gradually escalate pressure until I complied with their wishes. "Mom, we just want what's best for you," Patricia said, using the tone people employ when they're about to override someone's preferences for their own good. "And what if what's best for me isn't what you think is best for me?" That question seemed to genuinely confuse them. The possibility that I might have insights into my own needs and abilities that differed from their external assessment hadn't occurred to them. As I looked at these 3 adults who were proposing to manage my mobility based on statistical averages rather than individual performance, I realized that this conversation wasn't really about driving. It was about autonomy, competence, and the right to make decisions about my own life. They wanted me to prove that I was still capable of driving safely. But what they didn't expect was the method I would choose to provide that proof. If my children thought I was too old and slow to navigate modern traffic, I was going to demonstrate exactly how well a 73-year-old woman could handle the most demanding driving job in the modern economy. I was going to become an Uber driver, and I was going to be so successful at it that they would never again question my competence behind the wheel. After my children left that Tuesday afternoon, I sat in my kitchen staring at the car keys they had tried to convince me to surrender, and I made a decision that would change everything about how my family viewed aging and competence. Instead of defending my driving abilities with words, I was going to demonstrate them with actions. Instead of arguing about statistics and generalizations, I was going to provide concrete evidence of my skills. And instead of allowing them to manage my independence, I was going to turn my car into a business that would prove exactly how capable I remained. I had heard about Uber from my neighbor's granddaughter, who used the service regularly and often mentioned how convenient it was to have reliable drivers who knew the city well. What struck me was her comment that the best drivers were always the ones with the most experience, exactly the qualification that my children were treating as a disqualification. The next morning I drove to the library and spent 3 hours researching everything I could find about becoming an Uber driver. The requirements were straightforward: valid driver's license, clean driving record, reliable vehicle, and smartphone capability. I met every criterion, despite my children's assumptions about my technological incompetence. But what I discovered next was what convinced me this was the perfect way to prove my point. The online forums were filled with complaints about young, inexperienced drivers who didn't know the city, drove aggressively, had poor customer service skills, and treated driving as a temporary job rather than a professional responsibility. Passengers consistently praised older drivers who were courteous, knowledgeable about local routes, drove safely, and provided the kind of service that made the experience pleasant rather than merely functional. I was exactly the kind of driver that passengers were looking for. But my own family had convinced themselves I was too old to be trusted with basic transportation. That afternoon I downloaded the Uber driver app and began the application process. The background check took 3 days. The vehicle inspection took an hour and confirmed that my well-maintained sedan was in excellent condition. The online training modules were straightforward and covered everything from customer service to safety protocols. Within a week, I was approved as an Uber driver. I hadn't told my children about my plan because I wanted to present them with accomplished facts, rather than give them the opportunity to talk me out of what they would undoubtedly consider a dangerous and inappropriate decision. But what happened during my first week of driving was what convinced me I had made the right choice. My first passenger was a young professional who needed a ride to the airport for an early morning flight. She was impressed by my punctuality, my knowledge of the fastest route during rush hour traffic, and my ability to navigate construction detours that would have confused GPS systems. "You're the best Uber driver I've ever had," she said as I helped her with her luggage. "Most drivers my age don't know the city this well, and they drive like they're in a video game. You drive like you actually care about getting me there safely." That comment became a pattern. Passenger after passenger commented on my driving skills, my knowledge of the city, my courteous service, and my ability to make them feel safe and comfortable during their rides. The business traveler, who needed to get to 3 different meetings across the city, and asked me to wait between appointments because he trusted my reliability. The elderly couple who needed transportation to medical appointments and specifically requested me because I understood their mobility challenges and took time to ensure they were comfortable. The college student, who was nervous about taking Uber alone at night, but felt safe with me, because I reminded her of her grandmother and drove with obvious concern for her well-being. Within 2 weeks I had received my first 5-star rating. Within a month, I had accumulated more 5-star ratings than most drivers earned in 6 months. Within 2 months, Uber had designated me as a preferred driver and was routing premium ride requests to me. But the most satisfying validation came when regular passengers started requesting me specifically. "Are you available to drive me to the airport next Tuesday?" became a common request. Business travelers who used Uber regularly learned to schedule their rides with me days in advance because they knew I would be reliable, safe, and professional. Parents started requesting me to drive their college-age children to and from the airport because they trusted my judgment and driving skills more than they trusted younger drivers. Elderly passengers specifically sought me out because I understood their needs and drove with the patience and consideration that younger drivers often lacked. After 3 months of consistent 5-star ratings and increasing demand for my services, I decided it was time to share my success with my family. But what I planned to tell them was going to challenge everything they thought they knew about aging, competence, and their mother's abilities. I waited until our next family dinner to share my news, partly because I wanted to deliver it in person, and partly because I wanted to see their faces when they learned what their too old to drive mother had accomplished during the 3 months since their intervention. "Children, I have something to tell you about my driving situation," I announced as we finished dessert. Patricia immediately looked concerned. "Mom, please tell me you haven't been driving more than you should. We're still worried about your safety on the road." "Actually, I've been driving quite a bit more than usual. In fact, I've been driving professionally." The silence that followed was so complete that the tick of the dining room clock sounded like thunder. "What do you mean, professionally?" Robert asked slowly, as if he might have misunderstood my words. "I mean, I've become an Uber driver. For the past 3 months, I've been providing transportation services to passengers throughout the city." Michael dropped his coffee spoon with a clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. "Mom, you can't be serious. You're 73 years old." "Yes, I am. And I'm also Uber's highest-rated driver in our service area, with a perfect 5-star rating and more than 200 completed rides." Patricia was staring at me as if I'd announced I'd joined the circus. "Mom, this is insane. Driving strangers around the city? Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" "Actually, I do know exactly how dangerous it is because I've been doing it successfully for 3 months. And according to my passengers, my age is an asset, not a liability." But what I told them next was what really challenged their assumptions. "Let me share some feedback I've received from passengers," I said, pulling out my phone to read from my Uber rating summary. A 25-year-old businessman wrote, "Betty is the most professional driver I've ever had. She knows every shortcut in the city and drives with the kind of skill that only comes from decades of experience." I scrolled to the next review. A college student wrote, "I felt completely safe with Betty. Unlike younger drivers who speed and take risks, she drives with obvious concern for passenger safety while still getting me to my destination efficiently." Robert was shaking his head in disbelief. "Mom, those people don't understand the risks involved in elderly drivers operating vehicles commercially." "Actually, Robert, those people are experiencing the reality of my driving rather than making assumptions based on my age. They're evaluating my actual performance rather than statistical generalizations about elderly drivers." "But what about insurance? Liability? What if something happens?" "I carry commercial insurance that exceeds state requirements. I've passed background checks, vehicle inspections, and safety certifications. I've met every legal and professional requirement for commercial driving." Patricia tried a different approach. "Mom, even if you're currently capable of doing this safely, what about as you continue to age? This kind of work could become dangerous very quickly." "Patricia, if and when my abilities decline to the point where driving becomes unsafe, I'll stop. But that decision will be based on actual evidence of decreased competence, not on assumptions about what I should or shouldn't be able to do at my age." But what I revealed next was what truly stunned them. "There's something else you should know about my Uber driving. In 3 months, I've earned $12,000. The number hit them like a physical blow. Michael was the first to recover his voice. $12,000? In 3 months? "That's correct. I'm on track to earn over $50,000 this year, working part-time hours and providing a service that passengers consistently rate as exceptional." $50,000, Patricia repeated slowly. "Mom, that's more than most people our age earn at part-time jobs. It's also proof that competence and value don't automatically decline with age. In fact, my experience and skills have made me more valuable in this job than most younger drivers." The irony was obvious even to them. They had tried to restrict my driving because they assumed I was becoming incompetent with age, but the marketplace had validated my abilities by making me one of the most successful drivers in the service. "Mom, we had no idea," Robert began. "You had no idea because you made assumptions about my capabilities based on my age rather than evaluating my actual performance. You saw 73 and assumed decline, but my passengers see experience, skill, and reliability." But what happened next was what finally forced them to confront their own biases. Patricia's phone rang, and she answered with obvious irritation at the interruption. Hello? Oh, hi, Jennifer. What? Your regular Uber driver isn't available? You need someone reliable to take you to the airport? I watched Patricia's face as she processed her friend's request, clearly struggling with the cognitive dissonance of wanting to recommend her own mother as a driver when she'd spent months arguing that I was too old to drive safely. Actually, Jennifer, I might know someone. My mother is an Uber driver, and she's supposed to be very good. Very good was a significant understatement, but it was the first time Patricia had publicly acknowledged that I might be competent at something she'd been trying to prevent me from doing. Yes, she's been doing it for several months. Hold on, let me ask her. Patricia looked at me with an expression that combined embarrassment, confusion, and reluctant admiration. Mom, my friend Jennifer needs a reliable driver to take her to the airport tomorrow morning. Would you be interested in the job? I'd be happy to drive Jennifer to the airport. What time does she need to be there? As I took down the details and scheduled the ride through my Uber app, I watched my children grapple with the reality that their too-old-to-drive mother had become someone their friends specifically sought out for reliable transportation services. The intervention they had staged to restrict my driving had instead inspired me to prove my competence in the most public and measurable way possible. And now they were in the awkward position of having to acknowledge that they had been wrong about everything. 6 months after my children's intervention, my Uber driving had evolved from a point-proving exercise into a thriving business that challenged every assumption my family had made about aging and competence. But more importantly, it had attracted the attention of people who understood the value of experience in professional driving. The turning point came when I received a call from Uber's regional manager asking if I would be interested in participating in a new program they were developing for senior drivers. Mrs. Thompson, your ratings and passenger feedback have been exceptional. We're launching a pilot program called Uber Experienced that will specifically feature drivers over 65 who have demonstrated superior service and safety records. What would that involve? Premium pricing for passengers who specifically want experienced drivers, featured placement in our app, and marketing support that highlights the advantages of choosing drivers with decades of experience rather than just a valid license. Premium pricing. Uber had recognized that my age and experience were marketable advantages rather than liabilities, and they were willing to pay me more because passengers preferred my services to those of younger drivers. I'd be very interested in participating. Excellent. We'd also like to feature you in our marketing campaign. Would you be comfortable with some publicity about your success as a senior Uber driver? Publicity. The same driving abilities that my children had tried to restrict were now being celebrated by a major corporation as an example of what professional transportation service should look like. But what happened next was what really vindicated my decision. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the Uber Experienced program, with my photo on the front page of the business section under the headline 73-year-old proves age brings driving excellence, not decline. The article detailed my success as an Uber driver, my perfect rating record, and my annual earnings that exceeded those of most part-time workers half my age. But more importantly, it quoted passengers who explained why they specifically requested older drivers. I travel frequently for business, and I've learned to request drivers like Betty because they know the city, drive safely, and understand that getting me to my destination on time is more important than showing off. One passenger told the reporter. Young drivers are often distracted by their phones, don't know the best routes, and drive aggressively. Experienced drivers like Betty make the ride comfortable and professional, said another. The article generated responses from readers that validated everything I had experienced during my months of driving. Letters to the editor praised the idea of featuring senior drivers and criticized the assumption that older drivers are automatically less competent than younger ones. But the most satisfying response came from my own family. Robert called the morning the article appeared, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and embarrassment. Mom, I saw the newspaper article. I had no idea your Uber driving had become such a big success. I've been trying to tell you about it for months, Robert. I know, and I owe you an apology. When we staged that intervention about your driving, we thought we were protecting you, but we were actually trying to restrict you based on prejudices about aging rather than evidence about your abilities. Patricia's call came an hour later, with a similar message. Mom, reading about your success in the newspaper made me realize how wrong we were. We were so focused on what we thought you couldn't do that we completely missed what you actually could do. Michael's response was the most thoughtful. Mom, I've been thinking about why we reacted the way we did to your driving, and I think we were projecting our own fears about aging onto you. We're all getting older, and we're worried about losing our own independence someday. But instead of dealing with our fears, we tried to manage yours. But the real validation came from the flood of requests I received after the article appeared. Senior living communities started requesting me to provide transportation services for their residents who wanted reliable drivers they could trust. Medical facilities began recommending me to elderly patients who needed dependable transportation to appointments. Families started hiring me specifically to drive their elderly relatives because they trusted my judgment and experience more than they trusted rideshare drivers half my age. The demand became so great that I had to start scheduling rides weeks in advance, and my earnings doubled as word spread about the advantages of hiring an experienced professional driver rather than just anyone with a car and a smartphone. Mrs. Thompson, the Uber regional manager, called to inform me, "You've become our most requested driver in 3 counties. We're getting calls from passengers asking specifically for you, and we're having to turn people away because your schedule is full." What kind of passengers are requesting me? Everyone. Business travelers who want reliable service, elderly people who want patient and understanding drivers, families who want someone they can trust with their children or grandparents, and people who simply prefer professional service to the casual approach that many younger drivers take. The irony was perfect. The driving abilities that my children had viewed as declined and dangerous were exactly the qualities that passengers valued most: experience, caution, professionalism, and the kind of skill that can only come from decades behind the wheel. But what happened next was what really proved my point about the value of experience. 9 months after my children's intervention, I received an invitation that would demonstrate conclusively how wrong they had been about my driving competence and professional value. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Sarah Martinez from the State Department of Transportation. We're hosting a conference on senior driver safety, and we'd like to invite you to speak about your experience as a professional driver over 70. A state government agency wanted me to speak about senior driving, not as an example of decline or danger, but as a demonstration of continued competence and professional excellence. What would you like me to address in my presentation? We want you to share your experience as an Uber driver and discuss how age and experience can be assets rather than liabilities in professional driving. We're trying to challenge stereotypes about senior drivers and promote more nuanced approaches to driver safety evaluation." The conference was held in the state capitol, with an audience of transportation officials, law enforcement officers, insurance executives, and advocacy groups. I was the keynote speaker, addressing a room full of people who made policies and decisions about senior driver safety. Ladies and gentlemen, 9 months ago, my own children staged an intervention to convince me that I was too old to drive safely. Today, I'm here to share how I responded to their concerns by becoming the highest-rated Uber driver in 3 counties and earning over $40,000 in my first year of professional driving. The response was immediate and engaged. These were people who dealt with senior driver issues professionally, and they understood the significance of my success in ways that my children initially hadn't. The key insight from my experience is that chronological age is a poor predictor of driving competence. What matters is actual performance, demonstrated skill, and ongoing evidence of safe and professional service. I have decades of driving experience, intimate knowledge of local roads and traffic patterns, and the kind of customer service skills that can only come from years of professional experience. But what I said next was what really challenged their thinking about senior driver policies. Current approaches to senior driver safety often focus on restrictions and limitations rather than ongoing assessment and skill enhancement. Instead of assuming that all drivers over 70 need supervision or restriction, we should be evaluating individual competence and providing support for continued safe driving. The questions that followed demonstrated genuine interest in rethinking approaches to senior driver policy. Transportation officials wanted to know how to identify the difference between declining drivers who needed intervention and experienced drivers who remained highly competent. Insurance executives were interested in risk assessment models that considered individual performance rather than just demographic categories. "Mrs. Thompson, your success challenges some fundamental assumptions about age and driving competence. What would you recommend for families who are concerned about elderly relatives' driving abilities?" I would recommend focusing on actual evidence rather than assumptions. Has the person had accidents? Do they get lost frequently? Are they receiving traffic citations? or are family members simply uncomfortable with the idea of an elderly person driving? The most important moment came during the panel discussion that followed my presentation. A representative from the American Association of Retired Persons asked, "Mrs. Thompson, what do you think your experience teaches us about aging and continued competence in other areas besides driving?" It teaches us that competence doesn't automatically decline with age, and that experience often compensates for physical changes. More importantly, it teaches us that assumptions about aging can become self-fulfilling prophecies if we accept them uncritically. Can you explain what you mean by self-fulfilling prophecies? If we tell elderly people that they're too old to drive, work, learn new skills, or pursue new opportunities, many of them will accept those limitations even when they're not based in reality. But if we encourage continued engagement and challenge, people often discover that they're far more capable than society expects them to be. The conference concluded with a request that surprised even me. "Mrs. Thompson, we'd like to invite you to serve on our Senior Driver Safety Advisory Committee. Your experience and perspective would be valuable in developing more effective and fair policies for senior drivers." A state advisory committee wanted my input on policies that would affect thousands of senior drivers. The woman my children had tried to prevent from driving was being asked to help shape driver safety policy at the state level. But the most satisfying moment came when I returned home and shared the news with my family. "Mom, you were invited to serve on a state committee?" Patricia asked with obvious pride and amazement. "The same state committee that sets policies for senior driver safety. They want my perspective on how to evaluate driver competence based on actual performance rather than chronological age." Robert was shaking his head in what looked like genuine admiration. "Mom, when we staged that intervention 9 months ago, we thought we were preventing you from doing something dangerous. Instead, we inspired you to prove that you're more competent than any of us realized. You also taught me an important lesson about advocacy and self-determination. If someone tells you that you're too old to do something you're actually good at, the best response is to demonstrate your competence so clearly that they can't argue with the results." Michael summed up the transformation perfectly. "Mom, you didn't just prove that you could still drive safely. You proved that age brings skills and experience that young people often lack. You turned their attempt to restrict you into a lesson about the value of senior competence." But what happened next was what made the entire experience truly meaningful. My success as an Uber driver and my recognition as an expert on senior driver issues had inspired other elderly people to challenge assumptions about what they could and couldn't do based on their age. I started receiving calls from senior citizens who wanted advice about pursuing new careers, learning new skills, and resisting family pressure to accept limitations that weren't based in reality. The intervention that was supposed to restrict my independence had instead made me an advocate for senior empowerment and an example of what's possible when people refuse to accept age-based limitations that aren't supported by evidence. Sometimes the best response to being told you're too old to do something is to do it so well that everyone has to reconsider their assumptions about aging and ability. 2 years after my children's driving intervention, I was sitting in my office at the State Department of Transportation, preparing for a national conference on senior driver policy, when my phone rang with a call that would perfectly illustrate how completely my family's perspective had changed. "Mom, it's Patricia. I have a huge favor to ask you." "What can I do for you, sweetheart?" "My boss needs a driver for a very important client meeting tomorrow. Someone professional, reliable, and discreet. Everyone in the office knows about your Uber success, and my boss specifically asked if you might be available. My daughter was asking me to provide professional driving services for her workplace." The same daughter who had participated in an intervention to prevent me from driving because she thought I was too old and dangerous. "I'd be happy to help. What are the details?" The client is the CEO of a major corporation who's flying in for merger negotiations. "My boss wants someone who will make a good impression, knows the city perfectly, and can be trusted with confidential conversations. She said she'd rather hire you than use a regular car service because your reputation is so good." This had become a pattern. My professional success as a driver had made me the preferred choice for people who wanted reliable, discreet, high-quality transportation services. Business executives, elderly clients, families with special needs. They all specifically requested me because experience and professionalism had proven more valuable than youth and inexperience. But the real transformation was in how my family now viewed aging and competence. "Mom, I need to tell you something," Patricia continued. This whole experience with your Uber driving has changed how I think about getting older. I used to be terrified of aging because I thought it meant becoming increasingly incompetent and dependent. But watching you prove that experience can be an advantage made me realize that aging might actually make me better at some things, not worse. What specifically has changed in your thinking? I've stopped seeing my age as a countdown to incompetence and started seeing it as an accumulation of skills and knowledge. At work, I've started emphasizing my experience rather than apologizing for being older than some of my colleagues. And I've started making plans for what I want to accomplish in my 60s and 70s instead of just hoping I'll be able to maintain what I have now. This conversation had happened with all three of my children. My success as an Uber driver had challenged their assumptions about aging so fundamentally that they had to reconsider their own relationship with getting older. Robert had started a consulting business at 58, something he never would have considered before watching me launch a new career at 73. If Mom can become an Uber driver and earn $50,000 a year starting at 73, I can certainly start my own business at 58, he told his wife. Michael had enrolled in graduate school to pursue a degree he'd always wanted, but thought he was too old for. Mom proved that learning and growing don't stop at any particular age. If she can master smartphone apps and build a driving business, I can certainly learn new skills in my 40s. But the most significant impact had been on the broader community of senior citizens who had heard about my story. The Uber Experienced program had expanded to 12 cities, featuring senior drivers who provided premium services based on experience and professionalism rather than just basic transportation. The program was so successful that other rideshare companies had started similar initiatives. Senior centers had begun offering classes on starting businesses and pursuing new careers after traditional retirement age. These programs consistently used my story as an example of what was possible when people refused to accept age-based limitations. The most rewarding development was the letters I received from elderly people who had been inspired to challenge assumptions about what they could accomplish. Dear Mrs. Thompson, I'm 81 years old, and my family has been pressuring me to stop teaching piano lessons because they think I'm too old to work with children. Your story inspired me to keep teaching, and I now have a waiting list of students whose parents specifically want an experienced teacher rather than a young one. Mrs. Thompson, I read about your Uber success in the newspaper. I'm 79, and I've started a pet sitting business for elderly people who need someone reliable to care for their animals. Like you, I've discovered that age can be an advantage when people want trustworthy, experienced service. Dear Mrs. Thompson, my children staged an intervention about my computer use, saying I was too old to be safe online. I used your example to prove them wrong by starting an online business selling my handmade crafts. Last year I earned more money than my daughter makes at her part-time job. But the most meaningful recognition came when I was invited to speak at a national conference on successful aging. Ladies and gentlemen, 2 years ago my family held an intervention to convince me I was too old to drive safely. Today I'm a state policy advisor on senior driver safety. I've earned over $100,000 as a professional driver, and I've helped launch programs that support senior entrepreneurship and continued professional development. The audience of aging researchers, policymakers, and advocates gave me a standing ovation. But the most important moment came during the Q&A session. Mrs. Thompson, what's the most important lesson from your experience? The most important lesson is that competence doesn't automatically decline with age, and that society's expectations about aging often become more limiting than the aging process itself. When my family told me I was too old to drive, they were reflecting cultural assumptions rather than evidence about my actual abilities. What would you tell other seniors who are facing similar pressure to accept limitations? I would tell them to demand evidence rather than accepting assumptions. If someone tells you that you're too old to do something, ask them to prove it. What specific evidence shows that you can't perform the activity safely and competently? Often, you'll discover that their concerns are based on stereotypes rather than facts. And what would you tell families who are genuinely concerned about elderly relatives? Focus on actual performance rather than chronological age. Evaluate whether the person is actually having problems or whether you're uncomfortable with the idea of them continuing to be independent. And remember that taking away someone's autonomy without evidence of incompetence can be more harmful than allowing them to continue activities they perform well. As I concluded my presentation, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that Tuesday afternoon when my children tried to take away my car keys. Their intervention, intended to limit my independence, had instead inspired me to expand my capabilities in ways none of us had imagined. The woman they thought was too old to drive had become an expert on senior competence, a successful entrepreneur, and an advocate for age-positive policies. The driving skills they wanted to restrict had earned me over $100,000, state recognition, and national speaking opportunities. But most importantly, my experience had challenged assumptions about aging that limited not just me, but thousands of other older adults who had been told they were too old to pursue new opportunities, learn new skills, or contribute meaningfully to their communities. Sometimes the most powerful response to being told you're too old to do something is to do it so successfully that you change how everyone thinks about what's possible at your age. My children's intervention had been based on love and concern, but it had also been based on limiting assumptions about aging. My response had been to prove that those assumptions were wrong, and in doing so I had helped create a world where other older adults could pursue their own evidence of continued competence and capability. The keys they tried to take away had become the tools I used to drive not just passengers, but change itself. And every 5-star rating I received was proof that experience, skill, and professionalism don't decline with age. They often improve. Age had brought me wisdom, patience, knowledge, and the kind of professional competence that only comes from decades of experience. My family had learned that lesson the expensive way, but they had learned it completely. Now, instead of trying to restrict my independence, they called me when they needed professional driving services. And every time my phone rang with a request for my services, I was reminded that the most effective way to challenge age discrimination is not to argue against it, but to demonstrate excellence that makes the discrimination impossible to maintain. The intervention that was supposed to end my driving career had instead launched the most successful and fulfilling professional chapter of my life. At 75, I was busier, more financially successful, and more professionally respected than I had been at any point since my traditional retirement. My calendar was booked weeks in advance with speaking engagements, consulting requests, and driving appointments. My income exceeded that of most people half my age. My expertise was sought by government agencies and advocacy organizations, and my example had inspired thousands of other older adults to challenge limitations and pursue opportunities they had been told were inappropriate for their age. The greatest victory wasn't the money I'd earned or the recognition I'd received. It was the change in how my family and community viewed aging itself. They had learned that 73 wasn't the beginning of decline, but potentially the beginning of a new and exciting chapter of life. My children had tried to protect me from imaginary dangers based on age stereotypes. Instead, they had inspired me to prove that the real danger was accepting limitations that weren't based in evidence or individual assessment. The woman they thought was too old to drive had become proof that age brings advantages that youth can't match: experience, judgment, professionalism, and the kind of skill that can only be developed over decades of practice. And every time I started my car to begin another day of professional driving, I smiled, knowing that the keys my children had tried to take away had become the symbol of everything that was still possible, profitable, and professionally rewarding about being 73 years old and absolutely refusing to accept other people's assumptions about what I could and couldn't do. The most successful response to ageism, I had learned, was not to argue against stereotypes, but to excel so dramatically that the stereotypes became obviously false. And excellence, it turned out, had no expiration date. It just got better with experience.